Welcome, everyone. This is the sixth session of Exodus, Marching to Sinai with Rabbi David Silber. This class is a continuation of his ongoing series covering the first two books of Tanakh, as we've been doing for the past couple of months and years. This is with Rabbi David Silber, who is the dean and founder of Drisha. Sources for today's class will be coming from the book of Shemot and Bamidbar. If you have a preferred Tanakh or Chumash, you are welcome to keep it at hand. However, I will be sharing on the screen as Rabbi Silber quotes from Sfaria. And with that, I will hand things over to Rabbi Silber.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so we are proceeding along, as it says, marching to Sinai, and we're going to continue to march. So we're up to chapter 17 of the book of Shemot. We spent a couple of weeks on the Mon, story of the Mon. Of course, there's always more to say, but we're going to move forward in chapter 17. Chapter 17 begins in the following way. Vayisub kol hadat b'nei Yisrael mimidbar sin u'maseihem al pi Hashem vayachanu birfidim v'yein mayim l'shtotam. So the people, our congregation of Israel, is traveling from Midbar Sin, Masayhem, their journeys plural, Al Pi Hashem, on God's directive, literally God's mouth, and they dwelt in Refidim, they encamp in Refidim, and there's no water for the people to drink. That's the first verse of chapter 17. The commentaries have noted that actually when you look later in the Chumash has a list of the various stops that Israel makes in the desert. And the commentaries noted that actually the next stop after the previous story is not Refidim. There are a couple of stops before that, which the Torah skips over, but the Torah says they traveled L'maseihem, their journeys, plural. So there are several journeys. But the Torah is going to focus in on the story of Refidim when they come to Refidim, and this is what happens at Refidim. I'm wondering actually about this verse, because there's something about this verse that I think is unusual, and that is that the Torah says that the congregation of Israel traveled on their journeys al pi Hashem, which here seems to me superfluous. We know they're traveling through God's directive, but the Al Pi Hashem is interesting, and I'm wondering out loud, whether this verse is not what the Torah has in mind in the book of Devarim. I mentioned last time that the story of the Mon appears in three places. Here in chapter 16, it appears in chapter 11 in the book of Bamidbar. They complain there about the Mon, same food every day. And then it also appears in the book of Devarim. In the book of Devarim, the verse is Vayancha vayarivecha. God Vayancha, literally God caused you to suffer. Vayarivecha. And God starved you, literally. Ra'ev, made you hungry. And God gave you the man to eat, of which you did not know. As the Torah says, remember that they called it man. They didn't know what it is.
Rabbi Silber, could you give me the pasuk for this?
Oh, I have to find the verse. Let me see if I can find this. Yes, it's chapter 8 of Devarim. Chapter 8 of Devarim, beginning in the second verse. Chapter 8 of Devarim, verse number 2. Right? V'zachartu et kol haderech. That verse. And we're going to read straight. Remember Moshe is talking about the past, about the journey in the desert. Remember the journey that you had for 40 years. The purpose of which was to make it difficult for you and to test you. To know what's in your heart. Hatishmar mitzvotav imlo, this verse actually, in reading this verse, I'm reminded of what the Ramban says. Remember that the Ramban said that when God said to Moshe, I'm going to give them the mon, to test. That for Rashi, the test was related to the commandments associated with the mon. And for the Ramban, the test, choku mishpat, is not about commandments, nor is the mon about commandments primarily. The test is a test of how to teach us how to live under difficult situations, how to live in the desert. That's the Nisayon according to the Ramban. In this verse, I believe the Ramban may even cite this verse in support of his position. 40 years journeying in the desert, to test you, to try you, to know what's in your heart. Will you keep the commandments or not? So it's a question of, Rashi would say, would you keep the commandments? It's all about the commandments. But the Ramban would say, no, it's the journey. It's the living under these conditions. And the next verse, which is very striking, God subjected you to hardship and hunger. And God gave you to eat the man, which you did not know, nor did your ancestors know of it. To teach you. The human being lives not on bread alone. But rather, through all that comes out of God's mouth. So since I read these verses now, and since we did study the Mon together for a couple of weeks, just wanted to say that this verse is actually very interesting. When you read the Chumash in Shemot and in Bamidbar, there it talks about the Mon kitzapichit b'dvash v'shad hashamen, the cream, shad hashamen, the cream of the cream. In other words, it's very delicious. Shad hashamen, tzapichit b'dvash, a wafer in honey. When you read the verse over here, though, God gave you the man, and now vayancha vayarivecha, God caused you to have hardships. And then the question is the second half of the verse, and God gave you the man. Is this part of the hardship? Is this part of making you hungry or making you think you're hungry? Is that the point of the man? It wasn't so delicious. There actually was a hardship. You could read the verse both ways. You could read it, God first made you hungry, and then God gave you the man. Or you can read the verse, Vayancha vayarivecha, and this includes the man. God made you 40 years. Vayancha vayarivecha, God gave you the man. Now, why is the man Inoi? The people complain about the man that there's no variety. It's the same man every single day. Is that what it is? Is it that you can't save it from day to day? Is that the hardship? You never know where your next meal is coming from? Is it the fact that it's always the same food? Is it the fact that it's not recognizable food? In other words, we all know that psychological states can affect us in so many different ways, including how we relate to what we eat. But this verse actually is very striking. But anyway, the reason I cited this primarily was not just because of the Vayancha Vayarivecha. And by the way, it's interesting to note that this verse is in the book of Devarim. We know that Sefer Devarim casts a completely different light on the experience of Israel in general. It's just a different kind of book. It's a different way to see our experience. That's a Devarim theme. That's central to Sefer Devarim. But I was wondering about the last half of this verse, that God was there to teach you. You live not on bread alone. It's not that important. Bread means you have what you need. That's the lechem. And that's not what's important. Rather is a person lives al kol motzah pi Hashem. Literally that which comes out of God's mouth. But I was wondering that actually motzah pi Hashem is not playing off the verse that we have in the beginning of our chapter 17, when it says, Vayisu kol adat b'nei Yisrael b'midbar sin l'masehem al pi Hashem, right? In other words, the point of a motzah, right, is the destination. And Pi Hashem, here it says they traveled al Pi Hashem. And this verse, chapter 17, immediately follows the story of the Mon, right? The last verse talks about the Mon. The whole chapter 16 talks about the Mon. So in other words, perhaps the verse in Devarim, Ki al kol motza pi Hashem yichya adam, is playing precisely off chapter 17. Chapter 16 is about the Mon. And now, says the Torah, and Israel continued to travel al motza pi Hashem, based on literally God's mouth, God's directive, motza pi Hashem. Our destinations, our points of departure, and our destinations, right? Motzah can be a point of departure. Vayetze Yaakov mi Beersheva, right? Yaakov leaves there, so it's a point of departure. Here the point of departure is always al pi Hashem, and the place the Torah singles out is Refidim. We come to Refidim, and there's no water. We're back now to chapter 17, and question is, what's going to be the response to coming to a place where there's no water? And I think let me just put out there what I think is fairly obvious, that normally if you're traveling in the desert and you come to a place where there's no water, there's a lot of reason to be concerned. However, given the history of this people in chapter 16, that is, they come to Marah and the only water is bitter water. They travel, there's no water, they find water and it's bitter. What are they going to do? And God instructs Moshe to sweeten the waters, and the water is sweetened. Then we're traveling in the desert, there's no food. What's going to be? And God responds almost preemptively. It's not even clear God responds to their request, but God says, either to the request or even preempting the request, I'm going to provide for you food. You'll have food every single day. Now, you can't store it from day to day, and it's going to be a test for you, but there's going to be food. So the history of this people is that where they go, the two needs of basically food and water are being provided by God with the assurance that this is going to be so throughout the journey in the desert. And therefore, when they come to Refidim and there's no water, I think a logical response given their experience would be, okay, there's no water, so God's going to provide water. There's going to be water. We don't know how there's going to be water. Will God sweeten something? Will there be torrential rains? Will there be brooks we'll discover? We don't know. But there's no reason, given the history of the people, to be concerned. However, that is not their response. And their response is actually quite interesting. So this is actually a very important story. Let's just continue now a bit, and I'll stop and take comments and questions in a couple of minutes. It says, Vayarev ha'amim Moshe. This is verse number 2 of chapter 17. The people quarreled with Moshe. Vayarev, from the word riv, is a quarrel. Vayomru, tnu lanu mayim v'nishteh. Give us water to drink. Give us water to drink is not an unreasonable request. But the Vayarev, a riv means a real quarrel, right? We had that before. The shepherds of Abraham and the shepherds of Lot had a quarrel. That's when Lot and Avram separate. Says Avram to Lot, Al notim riva b'ni u'v'nech. We shouldn't be quarreling. We shouldn't have any fights. So let's just separate amicably. That's the riv. So here we have the riv. And the riv is with Moshe. So it sounds like a riv is just more than give us water. The riv is, given the fact that there is no water, and people feel under pressure, very often all kinds of fights break out, much of which is not related to the specific need of the moment. That Vayarav in Moshe, give us water. Vayomer ahem Moshe, mat rivuni modi. Why are you arguing with me? Mat nasunet Hashem. Why do you test God? Moshe says, in quarreling with me, implicitly, you're testing God. The next verse is Vayitzma Shama Am Lamayim. The people were very thirsty. Vayolena Am al Moshe, and the people complained against Moshe. Vayomer, they said, Lama zeh salami Mitzrayim. Why did you take us out of Egypt? To kill me and my children and the animals through thirst. So we have two different things. We have a tuna, Vayoran Amar Moshe. Why did you take us out of Egypt? And remember that in the previous story of the man, Moshe said, don't complain to me. It's not I who provide for you. I'm just a messenger. It's God that provides. So we have over here a second complaint. Here we have a fight, disagreement, not a fight, but a academic disagreement between the Ramban and the Ibn Ezra. The Ibn Ezra says there are two different camps of people. Some of them are directing the quarrel, the riv, towards Moshe, and the others are essentially complaining about God. The second verse, Ramazeh Heli Tanamim, is in effect a Tanasunet Hashem. Whereas the first, Matrivuni Modi, that's a different group. They're quarreling with Moshe. And the Ramban disagrees. The Ramban says there's not two different groups. There's two different arguments, two different things taking place. One is a riv, one is a quarrel with Moshe, a disagreement with Moshe, which is not about a specific thing. It may be generated by one thing, but it's a general riv. And the second is a testing of God, Matanasunet Hashem. It's unclear to them, they doubt whether God can provide water, even though they've experienced that already, that God does provide water. At this point, Moshe turns to God. Vayitzak Moshe el Hashem lemar, Moshe cried out to God, saying, Mar sela amazed, what can I do with these people? Od ma'at ustoluni, they're about to stone me. So again, there's two different things. Moshe is exasperated at this point. He's constantly complaining and against me. They're out to get me. And now God has a response. Vayomer Hashem el Moshe, Avar lifnei ha'am, v'kach me'itcha miziknei Yisrael. Avar lifnei means right, go ahead of the people. But take with you some of the elders. Umatcha sherikita bo'atayar, kach biyadcha v'halachta. And the staff with which you smote the Ya'ar, that's the first plague, when the water turned to blood. Take this in your hand and go. Hineni omeid lefanecha sham al atzur b'chorev, says God, remarkable verse. I will stand before you upon the rock in Chorev. V'kita batzur, hit the rock. V'yatsumi menu mayim v'shata'am, and water will come out, and the people can drink. Vayas kain Moshe v'yenei ziknei Yisrael, and Moshe did this before all of the elders. Vayikra shem ha'makom Masa u'Miva, so the place was called Masa and Miva. Al riv b'nei Yisrael v'yam nasotam et Hashem lemar, hayesh Hashem b'kirbeinu im ayin. The place, which was formerly called Refidim, was called now Masa and Riva. Masa and Riva. Miriva related to the word Riv, because of Israel's quarrel. We noted first there's a Riv, it says with Moshe. But also the testing of God, saying, is God truly in our midst or not? They're questioning. Perhaps testing God. God, are you with us or not? We're not sure. Let's see. If you can provide the water, you're with us. And if you don't provide the water, you're not with us. So there's the Riv and there's the Nisayon, there's the Masa Riva.
Rabbi Silber?
Yes.
Why is there a change in the from the plural to the singular in the middle of the pasuk? First, it's all collectively by Alinu, by Al Moshe, and then it's my.
You mean which pasuk? You mean pasuk?
Pasuk before. I don't have it in front of me, but
pasuk.
First they first in the plural, us, and then it goes into the singular, me.
I see there's a singular in verse number 3. Vayomer, singular, Lomazeh Heli Tanami Mitzrayim. It doesn't say Vayomru there, right?
Yeah.
It says Vayomru in verse number 2 when they complained, when they have the quarrel with Moshe, and in verse number 3 when they complain about God, there it's in the singular Vayomer. That is true. I noticed that myself. I don't have a good response to that. Sometimes, I mean, Israel is a collective. So the collective can either take the plural, because there are many people, or the people, right? The people is one people, but the nation, the people, they speak as one. I mean, perhaps to emphasize that when it comes to complaining against God, the people collectively are speaking, makes it even more problematic that they speak as one.
I
No
think it's
dissenting voices. Yeah,
Helitanu and then Lahamit Oti.
right, exactly. It's very interesting, isn't it? The Vayomer is singular, and we Tanakh is plural, and the Ot again is. But that would fit in well. In other words, when it comes to bringing us up out, they talk about they talk about individuals. When it comes to killing us, it's one. So again focusing on the negative, the people that complain to the people that you took us out to kill us, and you not just kill me, but kill my children and all the animals through thirst. I mean, the point is that the question, or rather, I would say the insight that you notice something which is interesting, which is perhaps a broader question. When does, in general, because we know that sometimes people are called as it uses the singular and sometimes the plural, and we'd have to examine each one very carefully. So I don't know the answer. What I suggested is the focus is on when it's on the negative, it uses the singular, as if everybody is complaining. But again, I haven't thought about it sufficiently to give a reasoned answer. So the question may be better than the answer. It's important. It's good you notice that. So we have Masa and we have Meriva. Let me just, and by the way, Masa and Meriva comes up in several places throughout the Bible in the Psalms. It's a very important story. And let me just point out the significance of this Nasotamet Hashem Lemar, Hayesh Hashem B'Kirbeinu Imayin. And that is, there's several things to be said about these few verses that we just read. Number one, that remember that when we crossed the sea, we had two previous stories. We have the story of the water in Marah, and we have the story of the man. In each of those two stories, the Torah uses the word l'nasot. In the case of Marah, Sham Sam Lochoku Mishpat B'Sham Nisahu. There God gave us chok and mishpat, laws, statutes, and there we were tested. There God tested us. And when it comes to the man, God said to Moshe, I'm going to give them, rain down the man from heaven. L'man anasenu, hayelech b'torati lo. I want to test the people. I want to try the people. I want to educate the people, I suggested. Will they walk in my path? Will they follow the Torah or not? In other words, in the first two incidents, first two stories, the purpose is for God to test us. When you get to story number 3, though, again, the Torah uses the same word, l'nasot. So it's a critical word over here. But here it's the opposite. Here it's not about God testing us. Here it's about the people seemingly testing God. Nasotamat Hashem. We see God. Are you really God? Can you give us water? Are you really in our midst or not in our midst? Hayesh Hashem b'kirbeinu imayin. They doubt. We're not sure that you're really with us. As Rashi notes, what do you mean you're not sure I'm with you? Who's been feeding you the entire time? You know, Rashi has the famous parable Rashi cites from the Medrash that the child is riding on his father's shoulders. And he stops and he turns to someone in the street and says, have you seen my father anywhere? And the father says, what do you mean, have you seen him? Who do you think supporting you, literally supporting you? And that's the story over here. What do you mean, Yesh Hashem b'kirbeinu imayin? What kind of question is that? How do you think you got here in the first place? So that's the Nasotamet Hashem. So 3 times the Torah uses the word Nasot. And we'll see there'll be another play in the word Nasot or Nes, which is coming up next in the story of Amalek. Hashem Nisi. So the Amalek story has to be read as a response to Masa and to Meriva, and perhaps everything that's transpired since we crossed Yam Suf. And we'll get to that momentarily. But before we get to that, I just want to point out something that I'm sure is on many of our minds, which is that in the story over here, when the people complain about the water, the instruction to Moshe is to go before the people. Take some of the elders with you. Take your staff, which you smote the Nile, and turn the water to blood. And I stand, says God, upon the rock in Chorev. It could be that during Refidim, maybe Chorev is a distance away. That's what the Ramban thinks. And you will hit the rock. And when you hit the rock, water will come out. And Moshe does this before all of the elders of Israel. That's the story in the book of Exodus, chapter 17. But all of us, no doubt, are thinking about the second parallel story, not in the book of Shemot, but rather in the book of Bamidbar, chapter 20. In Bamidbar, chapter 20, once again, the people complain about water. Can we bring that up on the screen? Bamidbar, chapter 20. Let's see what it says in Bamidbar, chapter 20. Right? Chapter 20, first the death of Miriam in verse number 1. The Medrash suggests that when Miriam was alive, there was a well that accompanied the people, the heir of Miriam. Okay, leave the Medrash out for now. But Miriam dies, and the next verse there's no water. And the people gathered about Moshe and Aaron. And the people said, Vayorev ha'am im Moshe. We have the same word, Vayorev, Riv. The people quarreled with Moshe. Vayomru, they said, at which we had died together with our brothers before God. I'll get back to that verse in a minute. Why did you bring us to the desert? That we and our beasts should die. Again, parallel to what we have over here. A parallel complaint in Bamidbar chapter 20. Why do you bring us up out of Egypt? Same verse, same phrase we have in our chapter. To bring us to this terrible place. There's no grain. There are no figs. There's no vines, no grapes. There's no pomegranates. I English don't, and there's no water to drink. And Moshe and Aaron go before the tent. They fall on their face, and God appears. Take the staff. Gather the congregation, you and Aaron. Speak to the rock, and it will give its waters. You take water out of the rock. You'll feed the people and their animals. Sounds exactly like our story. They complain about water. God says, take your staff. Here it says, speak to the rock and give them water. And Moshe took the staff as God had commanded him. And gathered all the people in front of the rock. Listen, you rebellious ones. Do you think we can get water out of a rock? Moshe smote the rock twice with his staff. And the congregation and their animals drank. And God says to Moshe and Aaron, you had no faith in me. To sanctify me before the people, you will not bring this congregation into the land that I give them. These are the waters of Rivah that the Israelites quarreled with God, through which God affirmed his sanctity. So we have a story which is obviously a parallel story, virtually identical story. In the first story, there's no critique of Moshe whatsoever. There's a critique of the people, perhaps, implicit, but no critique of Moshe. And here, when Moshe does seemingly a very similar thing, he and Aaron both are told, you had no faith in me, you didn't sanctify me, and as a punishment, you will not be able to enter the land. Famous story, familiar to all of us, of course, but I cite it here because it's parallel to our chapter. In our chapter, there's absolutely no critique of Moshe whatsoever. What is the difference between the two stories? This is the question. Now, I don't want to go fully into this question because this would take us, and it's an entire shiur. I will say that for those interested in pursuing this, there's a long Ramban on the verses in the book of Bamidbar. And it's an extremely interesting Ramban and very unusual Ramban. So we all know, of course, Rashi's opinion. Rashi's opinion is that the sin of Moshe was that he hit the rock. Because in the story in Bamidbar, unlike our chapter, in our chapter, God says to hit the rock. God said, hit the rock, and water will come out. But in the chapter in Bamidbar, it says, "V'dibartem el rasel," you should speak to the rock. Rashi says the sin was he hit the rock. The Rashbam agrees. You hit the rock. I said, speak to the rock, and you hit the rock, and therefore you disobeyed me. You didn't sanctify me before the people. That's Rashi's famous opinion. And what does the Ramban say about that? The Ramban says, I don't understand. If the point is you didn't sanctify me because I wanted a miracle, like talking to the rock will produce its waters, says the Ramban, I don't get it. If you hit a rock, it's not a miracle that water comes out. Furthermore, says the Ramban, God said to Moshe, Kachatamateh, take your staff. Why would he be told to take the staff if he's not going to use the staff at all? What is the function of taking your staff if, in fact, you're not supposed to use the staff? You're only supposed to speak and not supposed to hit. So I can't get into all the details of this now, but the Ramban rejects Rashi. And the Ramban then famously cites two other opinions. One is the Rambam. The Rambam says the sin of Moshe was getting angry. He shouldn't get angry. He said, the people, you rebellious ones, he yelled at them. And the Rambam famously talks about anger as being one of the worst qualities people can have. He generally talks about the middle road, the golden mean. One should follow the middle path. But when it comes to anger, you shouldn't. You should have no anger whatsoever. You have to be extreme in not demonstrating anger. It's a terrible quality. And that was Moshe's sin over here, that he got angry and yelled at the people. What does the Ramban say about the Rambam's position? He says, it's unusual to have such a strong critique of the Rambam. Hosif hevel al havolim. Basically, it's utter nonsense, says the Ramban. So he dismisses it totally. He says, first of all, Moshe gets angry many times. Moshe gets angry often. God also gets angry, but it's if anger is appropriate, it's appropriate. And he got much more angry in other situations, and he wasn't critiqued for that. Then the Ramban says, the best we can do if you want to go down that path to push away anybody who would question it is, he said, we take out water. He didn't say God will take out the water. And this could lead to people thinking that Moshe somehow has the power to get water out of a rock. And since he spoke in such a way which could be misinterpreted, that he himself is taking the water out of the rock, as opposed to it's a miracle. It's God's miracle. That's the sin. That's you didn't believe in me. You didn't believe in me that you sanctified my name. So the Ramban, after he quotes all of those, it's a very unusual Ramban, which I recommend you look at. And the Ramban says, and the truth, via emet, that this is related to a sod, to a mystery. I came across this. I was thinking about this actually yesterday. Everybody knows when you study the Ramban on Torah, which is one of the great books of our tradition, without question. I mentioned many times Rabbi Lichtenstein said, Olav Shalom said that if he had one book on a desert island, he could have just one book, it would be the Ramban's commentary on the Torah. And that's from somebody who didn't at all engage in the Kabbalistic side of the Ramban, which is very, very present in the Ramban. But the other Ramban, his sense of language, his sense of themes of the Bible, his sense of halacha, the integration of halacha with the Torah Shabbat Peh and Torah Shabbat. The Ramban is unbelievable. But generally speaking, what's interesting here in this story in Bamidbar is that if you're familiar with the Ramban, he has an interpretation. And then at the end of it, sometimes he says, V'al derech ha'emes, which means Kabbalah. In terms of Kabbalistic thinking, which he doesn't want to reveal fully what he means. It's only the initiates, but he does write it for the initiates, and he gives some kind of Kabbalistic interpretation. What's unusual actually in Bamidbar, chapter 20, in Moshe hitting the rock, is that there the Ramban says, V'al emet, not al derech ha'emet. Says the true interpretation is, the Ramban believed that the true interpretation, he rejects all the others, that the real interpretation is actually a mystical one, that the mystical interpretation is actually the pshat. And he distinguishes between the two stories. I wanted to mention this. I thought it was very interesting, and it's very unusual that the Ramban would formulate it this way. What the Ramban, because what bothers the Ramban is, what do you mean you didn't go hemant in me? You didn't have faith in me. If the only interpretation he even thinks is somewhat valid is Rabbeinu Hanano's interpretation, which is that they said we instead of God. But that's not a lack of faith. That's a misspeaking. That's perhaps a misleading speech. Okay, Rabbeinu Hanano would say, yes, it's not really a lack of faith, but it could be perceived as such. But the Ramban doesn't like that. And the Ramban distinguishes our story from the one in Bamidbar in the following way. What the Ramban noticed, I'm mentioning this Ramban just because there's certain Rambans it's good to know, and I find this particularly interesting. What the Ramban notices, he notices pretty much everything. What the Ramban notices is that in our chapter, God says to Moshe, "Hineni omeid lefanecha sham al atzur b'chorev." I stand above the rock in the Chorev. That doesn't appear at all in Bamidbar chapter 20. God speaking of God standing above the rock. And the Ramban focused on that. I believe the Zohar has a similar focus, actually, and not surprisingly. And what the claim the Ramban makes, actually, is that the sin of Moshe is that in our chapter, God, Hashem is Omeid Shamul Atzul B'Chorev. The Ramban talks about the God has different qualities. Different names of God suggest different qualities. The Ramban suggests, if I understood it correctly, that in our story, God appears above the rock, and the quality of God that is present there is Hashem, which is the God who combines judgment with, but also primarily the God of mercies. And the idea that the mercies can overcome the din, the chesed overcomes the gvura. That's the idea. You appeal to the God of mercies, and the God of mercies can overcome the idea of judgment. But in Sefer but in what Moshe does by hitting the rock twice, the claim of the Ramban, rooted in Kabbalah, is that Moshe doesn't appeal to God's mercies to overcome din. He's appealing to God's sense of justice or of stern judgment to defeat judgment. In other words, for the Ramban thinks this is the pshat of Chumash, actually, that the lohem mantam is you didn't have faith in my attribute in the God of mercy. You didn't appeal to the mercies. You appeal to some kind of God of judgment, and that's lohem mantam b'ilahakdisheni. And the Ramban goes in this path. I'm simply pointing out, first of all, that the two stories are two seemingly parallel stories, with the difference of this very odd verse, Omeid lefanecha sham al atzur, and that the Ramban, whose interpretation on the Torah is suffused with Kabbalistic thought, but in this particular instance, he actually believes, if I understood him correctly, And this is a pshat in the Chumash. No other interpretation makes sense. Means you didn't believe in me. No, you didn't believe in me, the Ramban says, mean you didn't believe in the qualities that I have and the relationship between my qualities, that the quality of mercy has the power even to overcome and to defeat the quality of judgment. You appeal to my quality of judgment in some sense to overcome judgment, but you didn't appeal to my mercies. That's Ramban claims that's the difference between the story in Shemot and the story in Bamidbar. But leaving out the story in Bamidbar now, the story of Shemot has Masa Umariva, and again, the people whom God was supposed to test end up testing God. And testing God with the question, Hayesh Hashem b'kirbeinu imayin. Is God in our presence or not? We're not sure. And the next verse, and I'll stop and take questions before that or comments, but the next verse is Vayavo Amalek. Amalek comes, Vayilachem im Yisrael b'fidim. Let me take just one word about this verse. Amalek comes and engages Vayilachem, fights with, Milchama is a war, and fights with Israel in Refidim. I've always wondered for many years now whether Vayilachem, which means to fight, is related to the word lechem, which is bread, because the previous story of the man, which is the critical story, is all about God providing lechem. But now the people are questioning who's actually providing for us. In doing so, they're not doubting only about the water, they're doubting in general. It's God providing for them. They're doubting God who said, and as a response to these doubts, these questions, comes Amalek, Vayilachem im Yisrael b'fidim. Two other points, and I will then stop and take comments and questions. First of all, I'll come back to this, that this verse is strange. That Amalek comes and fights with Israel in Refidim, because the Torah just told us in the previous verse, the place is not called Refidim. The place is called Masa Umariva. The name was changed. It starts with Refidim in the beginning of the story. They encamp in Refidim, but Vayikra Shema Makom Masa Umariva in the previous verse. Ariv b'nei Yisrael v'yanasotam et Hashem. So I should have said Vayavo Amalek Vayilachem im Yisrael b'masa umariva, but no, the Torah says Vayilachem im Yisrael b'fidim. Is there something to that? Let's leave that question on the side. I believe there is. And secondly is, what does it mean Vayavo Amalek? What is Amalek doing here in the first place? We're not passing through the territory of Amalek. Amalek is nowhere near where they are. They're in the desert. Amalek is not there. Amalek somewhere down south, wherever Amalek is. They're certainly not in this area. We're in Vayavo Amalek. So apparently, Amalek is different. Amalek is not, if you pass through their territory, they're going to attack you. Amalek is actually preemptive. Amalek goes out and searches for you. That's Vayavo Amalek. What do they have to do with anything? They're in the middle of a desert. Amalek comes and attacks. That's interesting about Amalek. Vayavo Amalek, then Vayilachem, perhaps related to the Lechem, and then we'll get to Refidim in a moment. Let me stop here at this point and take any comments or questions, anything that's been said so far.
Yes, I'd like to just highlight a question that came in from chat
Right.
or about a half hour ago
Yes.
from Ari Bleich. Quote, perhaps contra both Ramban and Ibn Ezra, there are not two things at all. In verse 2, the Riv is Moshe's perception of the event, as we see from the end of the verse, and not accurate vis-a-vis their intent. Vaya'alen is softer and a better indication of their feelings. Or, does verse 7 make it clear that Moshe was right? That may depend on whether Moshe named it in verse 7, in which case less significant, his take, or did God name it? Ari, did I get that right?
I don't think God is naming it. It's not clear who's Vayikra is over here. That's a very good question. The place is then called. I don't know. Not clear who's giving it this name. But whoever is giving it the name, it does appear that this actually is the name. And this is Masa Umariva is an expression that appears not just here, not just in Bamidbar, but in particular in the Psalms. And Masa Umariva is seen by the psalmist as a very significant event, a highly significant event. So it's whoever names it it's clear that Masa Umariva is actually the name. And here the Riv is with, yes, the initial Riv is actually with Moshe. As opposed to Bamidbar, there it says the Riv was with God, actually. That's another interesting difference. Here the Riv seems to be with Moshe, and the Sayon is God. Nasotamet Hashem Remar. But I think it's whoever named it, that in fact is the name, says the Chumash. And it just highlights the next verse. Vayilachem im Yisrael b'Refidim. Why would the Torah jump back to Refidim, given the fact that it just emphasized the great significance of Masa Umariva? Then giving a name to a place, we have this, for example, in the book of Bamidbar, when it's the second story of the Mon, when the people eat all these stuff their gullets with the slug, with the quail, the place is called Kivrot HaTa'ava. And the idea of naming the place is to underscore the significance of that event, of that moment, of that experience. Here too, it's to emphasize Masa Umariva. This is a very significant event. It really is a demonstration of a lack of faith and a lack of gratitude. And that this question and this doubt, Hayesh Hashem b'kirbeinu im ayin, one might say kind of spiritual weakness, is what engenders Amalek. Amalek attacks you with a moment of weakness. That's the Amalek of the Bible. And the weakness here is a spiritual weakness. Is God in our presence? Is God in our midst or not? Ayavu Amalek. As we will see, that's when Amalek shows up on the scene. What else is there? Yes.
I notice another difference between the story in Shmot and Bamidbar, and that is in Shmot, Moshe brings along the Ziknei Yisrael, whereas in Bamidbar it's just Moshe and Aaron. The Ziknei Yisrael are kind of the collective memory, those who don't just forget momentarily because they don't have food anymore. But for some reason, where are the Ziknei Yisrael in Bamidbar?
Okay, that's an excellent point. The Ramban actually makes that point. The Ramban's slightly different formulation. The Ramban's formulation is, what Chaim is pointing out, which is a very important point, is that here is take the Ziknei Yisrael, and in Bamidbar, there's no Ziknei Yisrael. The Ramban, though, formulated slightly differently. The Ramban said that in Bamidbar, the Ramban claims that in Bamidbar, God said to Moshe, go before the people. That the place where the rock is in Choreb, which the Ramban says is a distance from Refidim. And the miracle that's happening is not before the congregation, it's before the Ziknei Yisrael. And maybe the water flowed from there back to Refidim, maybe there was a lot of water, maybe people came afterwards. But in the book of Bamidbar, there it says, it's there, it doesn't mention the Ziknei Yisrael, but it mentions the entire congregation. In verse number 10, Vayakilu Moshe v'Aaron et hakahal el pnei hasela. That in Bamidbar, it's not just Ziknei Yisrael, it's the congregation, whole congregation, and that's what God said to Moshe. Yango hamantem bi lahaktisheni li'enei bnei Yisrael. You didn't sanctify name before all of Israel, because in Bamidbar, all of Israel is there, not just the Zikanim. For whatever reason, in our story, it's only the Zikanim that are there. The people remained back in the camp, and Moshe went in front of them. And that's why it says that the failure in Bamidbar was a failure to be Makadesh Shem Hashem before the entire congregation, which is more severe. It's like the idea of Parhesia. When you have a Chilul Hashem, which is the Parhesia, the more people that see that experience that Chilul Hashem, the more significance is. So the Ramban did notice what Chaim notices, but he flipped it. In other words, in Bamidbar, he emphasized that it's the entire congregation. It's not the Zikanim at all. It's before all of the people. That was the Ramban's point. And therefore, that's why that's more severe. That's why the failure to sanctify God's name or sanctify God before the people is more severe. But he picked up on that difference between the Ziknei Yisrael disappearing somehow in the second story, because it's not just the Ziknei Yisrael, it's actually everybody. That's the Ramban actually makes that point. That's anybody else?
Yes. One at a time. That's it in chat. Anyway, All right.
Okay, so we'll continue. Right. All right. Now we come to Amalek. We'll start with Amalek now. Amalek is a big topic. So first of all, Amalek comes out of nowhere. They're not crossing through there like Moab. You come close to the land, Amalek is concerned. Not Amalek. Amalek attacks you. Now, why Rephidim? We'll get to why Rephidim in hopefully in a little while. Vayama Moshe Yoshua b'charlanu anoshim b'tzehi lachem b'Amalek. Macha anochi nitzav arosh hagivah umateh Elohim biyadi. Moshe said to Yoshua, choose some people that say Hilachem and go and fight. Begin Hilachem, fight with Amalek. Tomorrow, I will go to the top of the mountain and take with me the staff of God. Now, here's something very interesting. And this raises a very big question about our study of Chumash. And that is, Vayama Moshe Yoshua. God said to Yoshua, who is Yoshua? The fact of the matter is, the Torah has never mentioned Yoshua. But the point is that the reader, right? Moshe said to Yoshua, the Chumash is assuming that the person reading this story knows who Yoshua is. It's interesting because if you never saw the Chumash before, you would know who Yoshua is. It says nothing about him. Later we find out later about Yoshua. It's almost a sense that, again, who is the reader? Who is the reader of this? Who is the assumed reader? The assumed reader the Chumash seems to assume that you know who Yoshua is. In any event, I'll come back to Yoshua a little later. Moshe says to Yoshua, pick some troops, go out and fight with Amalek. So Yoshua is presented here as a military man. Maybe he's the general. He's the military guy. You're going to fight with Amalek, do battle with Amalek, but I'm not going to be with you. I'm going to be on top of the mountain with the staff of God in my hand. Yoshua does what Moshe commands him to do. He's going to fight Amalek. Moshe Aaron v'Chur alu rosh hagivah. And Moshe goes to the top of the mountain, but he takes with him two people. Takes Aaron, that's his brother, and he takes Chur. We don't know who Chur is, but he takes somebody named Chur. Later on in the Chumash, we know that Betzalel, the one who built the Mishkan, is Betzalel ben Uri ben Chur. He's seems to be the grandfather of Betzalel, the one who makes the Mishkan. And in chapter 24, when Moshe is going to go back up the mountain to get the tablets, and he gets instructions about building the Mishkan, at the end of chapter 24, Moshe said to the people, I'm going to leave you now. I'm going to go to the mountain. V'nei Aaron v'Chur imachem. And I leave with you Aaron and Chur. Mibal dvarim yigash aleihem. That's in chapter 24. Whoever has a matter, mibal dvarim, perhaps a legal matter, a davar, should approach them. So Aaron and Chur were left behind in chapter 24. Moshe, I'm leaving, but I leave with you Aaron and Chur. If you have any judicial matters, any quarrels, any issues, take it up with Aaron and Chur. They function in chapter 24, I would say, as judges. Normally the court is a court of three. But in the case when Moshe leaves, he leaves Aaron and Chur with them. So we have a court of two. I mentioned that over here because here we have Aaron and Chur, and we don't yet know why Aaron and Chur are accompanying Moshe. We'll get to that in a moment. Now the Torah says a very strange thing. When Moshe would raise his hands up, Israel would be winning. The Gavar Yisrael, right? Israel would be winning when Moshe's hands were raised up. But when he put his hands down, Amalek would be winning. Whenever he let down his hand, Amalek prevails. Now there's a small problem over here with the language of this verse. Because if it were up to me, I would not have written it that way. But it's not up to me. But I would have written it the following way. When Moshe lifts up his hands, we'll get to this, why this should be so. When Moshe raised his hands, Israel would prevail. And I would have written, V'kasher nachu yadav, but when his hands fell down, v'gavar Amalek. In other words, yaniach is an active verb. To put your hands down, you would say lo haniach. Nachu yadav means your hands fell down. We know when his hands get tired. In the next verse, but de Moshe kfeidim, his hands are heavy. He can't sustain his hands, so they fall down. Kasher yaniach yado suggests that he actually puts his hands down. But clearly the sense should be he wouldn't put his hands down, because when he puts his hands down, Amalek is prevailing. So why did the Torah say kasher yaniach yado as opposed to kasher nachu yado? And even though in the very next verse it says videi Moshe kvedim, his hands were heavy. Vayichu even vayosimu tachto vayeshev aleha. So they put a rock, and Moshe sat on the rock. V'Aaron v'Chur tamchu biyadav, and Aaron and Hur supported his hands. Mizeh echad u'mizeh echad, one on one side, one on the other. Vayhi yadav emunah ad bo hashamesh, and his hands remained emunah, which means steady. Emunah means steadfastness. His hands remained steady until nightfall. Vayachalosh Yoshua et Amalek v'et Amalek v'Chorev. So Joshua was able to weaken Amalek and his people by the sword. There are a lot of questions over here. Amalek is a big topic, so let me address some of the issues which emerge from these verses, and there's a lot more to be said. What is Moshe doing on top of the mountain? Let's start with that. What is Moshe doing there? What do you mean when he raises up his hands? So one way to understand it, which I think is the prevalent way that the commentaries understand it, and I think the Mishnah understands it this way as well, that when Moshe raising his hands means Moshe's praying. We have this similar thing earlier with Ros Kapav, right? Efros Kapai El Hashem. When Paro says to Moshe, pray for me, and Moshe at one point says, I will raise up my palms towards the heaven. And we have it in the prayer of Shlomo as well. Raising up hands towards the heaven is a demonstration of prayer. Either it is accompanying prayer, either it's seen itself as a kind of prayer. Lifting up my hands right towards the heavens, that's a kind of prayer. So what Moshe is doing is Yeshua is busy fighting on the ground, and Moshe is actually praying, right? The famous Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah asked the question, "V'chi yadav shel Moshe osot milchama." The fact that Moshe raises his hands, right? How would that help you? What does raising hands have to do with war? And the Mishnah's answer is when Moshe would raise his hands, that people would see his hands raised towards heaven, and they too would be inspired to have a kind of prayer. That's the Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah. But in any event, that certainly is one way to read it. That kasher yorbim yodo is parallel to efros kapai, right? To raise up one's palms to heaven, which clearly denotes prayer. But there is another way to read what's happening in the story over here, and Moshe's role. And that is that actually the question, the people had asked the question, Hayesh Hashem b'kirbeinu imayim. Is God in our presence or not? People are not convinced that God is actually with them, despite the fact that God is the one that's been supporting them the entire time. And basically, the story of Vayavo Amalek comes, and it's not, when you read the story over here, what's very striking about Amalek, and the same thing is true of Amalek, for example, in Megillat Esther. The story of Megillat Esther, the story of Amalek, Haman is the Agagite. When you read that story, okay, we know it has a happy ending, or not the happiest of endings, but we do survive, we defeat Haman's armies, etc. But when you read the Megillah, actually, if you've never read it before, and you have no knowledge of anything, it's very unclear what's going to happen, because everything's pointing in a very bad direction. And yes, one night the king can't sleep, bring me the record books, he discovers about Mordechai, Haman, etc., etc. But we come so close. That's the point of Amalek. Hayesh Hashem b'kirbeinu vayavu Amalek. And the question is, will Israel survive Amalek? Perhaps another question is, should Israel survive Amalek, given the ingratitude and the lack of recognition, and the whole point that God had taken us out of Egypt to be God's servants, and Hayesh Hashem b'kirbeinu l'mayin. So one way to read what Moshe was happening with Moshe is not so much prayer, but actually judgment, like thumbs up and thumbs down. When Moshe would raise his hands up, lift his hands up, Israel was winning. But when he puts his hands down, that's a suggestion that maybe the court has determined that Israel doesn't deserve to win. But the court doesn't consist of one person. The court consists of three. The Beit Din is a Beit Din of three. So there's the main judge, that's Moshe. But on either side of Moshe, there's another judge. One is Aaron and one is Hur. Later in the Chumash, of course, when Moshe leaves, Moshe says to the people, I'm leaving, but Aaron and Hur remain with you. These are two judges. When you have a matter, Mibal Dvarim, Yigash Alehem. And here, the other two judges, Aaron and Hur, are able to support Moshe's hands. That is to say, the decision is rendered by the court that yes, Israel is in fact worthy of being saved. And we are able to survive. We're able to defeat Amalek. We don't destroy Amalek, by the way, in the story. The text is very clear. That Joshua weakened Amalek. It doesn't say defeated. He weakened Amalek by the sword. So Amalek is not destroyed. Amalek is still very much around, which is the clear message of the last verses of this chapter. And we'll get to that. But this is the story then. There's two different ways to read it. And by the way, we have, and these hands remained steady until nightfall. We have a custom, there's a common practice of the Jewish people, which recalls the story over here. What practice is that? Who knows what practice the Jewish people, not everybody, but maybe some of you never experienced it, depending where you pray for the high holidays. But if you prayed in certain places for the high holidays, there's a very interesting custom that the Jewish people have. Let's say on Yom Kippur. How do we start Yom Kippur? We start Yom Kippur before Yom Kippur. Of course, we start Yom Kippur with the meal before Yom Kippur, but we get to the synagogue and we say Kol Nidre. Kol Nidre is the ritual that we perform just before Yom Kippur, essentially a nullification of vows by the ceremonial court. So the Chazan is one of the court, but typically the Chazan does not stand alone. Somebody stands to the right of the Chazan and somebody stands to the left of the Chazan. And when the Chazan says we, the court, are nullifying the vows of the previous year, it's not the Chazan talking by himself. It's the Chazan's court. It's the court of three typically. One standing to the right and one standing to the left. But that everybody does. That's a common practice. But there's another practice. And that is that during the entire Yom Kippur, starting at the nighttime and the entire day, that when the Chazan leads the service, somebody stands to the right and somebody stands to the left. The entire day. Until nightfall. And that exactly is coming right out of the story over here. That Moshe is praying for the people. May also be a judge. Yom Kippur begins with judgment, begins with the court, actually. But fundamentally, it's a day of prayer. It's a day of judgment. It's a day of prayer. It's a day of mercies. And the court which convened, the Chazan was part of the court when Yom Kippur begins, but the court, in a sense, remains in session. Aaron v'chur tamchu b'yadav, maybe not even so much as a court, but as a group of people representing the community who prays for the people. It's the three of them praying for the people. And that is based on this story over here. Aaron v'chur tamchu b'yadav, mizeh echad u'mizeh echad. V'yadav emunah ad bo hashamash. So this is the first time we encounter, well, Amalek is mentioned actually one time in the book of Bereshit. Not going to go there, but here we have the story of Amalek, which attacks Israel at moments of weakness. And that's a very important point about Amalek. The weakness over here is not necessarily a physical weakness. Israel is able somehow to stave off Amalek, to weaken Amalek, etc. But if there's a weakness over here, it's a weakness of it's a spiritual weakness. People have doubts about whether God is with them altogether. And what's interesting is this is the beginning of the Amalek story. There are a few more verses that perhaps we'll get to next time. But this story over here, this Amalek attacking us over here, is of course mentioned in the book of Devarim. We're all familiar with it, of course. It's called Parshat Zachar. We read that before Purim. Remember what Amalek did to you, says the Torah, the 25th chapter of Devarim in Parshat Zachar, that we read before Purim. Remember what Amalek did when you were on the path, Baderech, on the path when you left Egypt. Being Baderech Derech is a dangerous place, because when you're Baderech, you're on the path, you're neither here nor there. Derech is a time of vulnerability, time of transition, a time of vulnerability. Asher karcha baderech, they encountered you at baderech once again on the path. And you were ayef, and you were yageya, you were very tired. And it says v'lo yorei Elohim, and did not fear God. Did not fear God is not clear whether it refers to Israel. You were both tired and weary and not God-fearing. That's one possibility. And the other possibility, which most of the commentaries prefer, is that below Yorei Elohim refers to Amalek. You were tired and weary, and they did not fear God. We have to remember that, right? And we'll get to this next week, to the continuation over here, which talks about, at the end of this chapter, a war of God against Amalek in every generation. And in the book of Devarim, it talks about your war against Amalek. So the parsha over here in Shemot 17 is God's war against Amalek, and the parsha in Parshat Zachar and Devarim is God's war against Amalek. But the point is, you were weary and you were tired. I want to come back now to, we'll pick up more with this. This is Amalek is such a central story of the Bible. But I want to come back to a question that I raised about half an hour ago, and that is, why did the Torah, when it introduces Amalek, Vayavu Amalek, Vayilachem im Yisrael b'Refidim, fought against Israel in Refidim? Why didn't it say Masa Umariva? The place was called Masa Umariva. Why Refidim? So Rashi quotes a Medrash, and in this case, the Medrash is actually the Pshat. Not exactly the way Rashi formulates it, but I believe it's actually the simple Pshat. What is Refidim? So the Medrash noticed that the place Refidim, he calls it Raf Yodayim. What does Raf mean? Rafa, Raf, weak. Weakness of hands. They came to a place called weakness of hands, right? That's what Amalek attacks. Weakness of hands is exactly what we've just read, right? When Moshe would raise his hands up to heaven, Israel would prevail. Kasher Yoniach Yodo, when he put his hands down, Amalek would prevail. Videi Moshe Kvedim, but Moshe's hands were heavy. Weakness of hands. He can't keep his hands up. His hands are going to fall down. Israel's going to lose. Weakness of hands. But with the assistance of Aaron and Hur, Mizeh Echad, each one on one side, one on the other, his hands became steady. We're able to be steady until evening. Next week, I want to talk more about Amalek. I'll stop and take some questions. I do want to make one last point, though, about, since I mentioned Yom Kippur and the practice in many places where someone stands to the right and left of the Chazan throughout all of Yom Kippur. What's interesting is, of course, beginning before Rosh Hashanah, and for the Sephardi community, even beginning with the beginning of Elul, we recite the special slichot. The custom of the Ashkenazim is that the slichot, Erev Yom Kippur, are the shortest slichot. They're by far the shortest slichot. Every slicha has one main slicha that we say. what is this? What is the pismon that is recited by the Ashkenazim Erev Yom Kippur? Does anybody remember what it is? It's one of my favorite pismonim. The tagline for the pismon Erev Yom Kippur is Machar yiyeh ha'ot hazeh. Tomorrow, it's Erev Yom Kippur. Machar yiyeh ha'ot hazeh. And the entire poem plays off two words, mizeh u'mizeh. You recall it? Mizeh u'mizeh. And it actually is the story over here. Aaron Bechor, mizeh echad u'mizeh, right? That's mizeh u'mizeh. So the poet, whoever it was, and the community that assigned that poem to Erev Yom Kippur, it reinforces the connection between the story over here, how it's understood. Mizeh echad u'mizeh echad, and Yom Kippur. And the practice of Yom Kippur, that the entire Yom Kippur, which is the day of prayer, that Moshe is supported by one on one side, one on the other. And the idea of Yom Kippur, maybe the deeper point, is that we need each other's support. When it comes to prayer, even though obviously the best prayers, the deepest prayers are probably said privately in your own room when no one's around, as Rav Nachman noted, but we come together as a community to pray. And in coming as a community, we are supporting each other. We need each other's support in life and especially in prayer. And this is the mizeh u'mizeh. And that's the practice that the Ashkenazim have, that Erev Yom Kippur, machar ha'ot hazeh, mizeh u'mizeh. Okay, I'll stop at this point. Does anybody have comments or questions about anything we've done till now? We'll continue with Amalek next week. And then move right into chapter 18, which gets us up to Sinai.
Okay, Chaim, and then from chat. Okay.
Yes.
Just in terms of the active verb v'yaniach as opposed to nach, is it possible to give an interpretation that it's a concept of yadav emunah, that when Moshe had faith that the people were going to be able to serve God, his hands were strong, but but when he had doubts about the people, that's when Amalek takes over.
Yeah, for sure, 100%. I like that 100%. It's also very interesting that in the story over here, which we see as parallel to the one in chapter 20 in Bamidbar, there the crime was Yan lo hemantebi. And Moshe says lo hemantebi. You need to, as a leader, you have to have faith in the people. By the way, maybe next week, I don't want to get to it now because I have a slightly different reading of the chapter 20, a different understanding of why there Moshe is punished and not here. Maybe I'll start with that next week. It's not what the Rambam says exactly, but it's along his lines, and I think it's an interpretation that I personally like very much. But yes, I would say that's a very good point, that the leader has to have faith in the people. And Moshe, we know on occasions, has had less than full faith in the people. That's for sure. When he has faith in the people, he can lead and they can succeed. And when he lacks the faith, when it's Yoniach Yodo, that's when we have problems. Okay, I'll take one more comment. Anybody else?
Two more. I just have one from chat and then one from Devorah Sondheim.
Yes,
from chat, from Susan Lieberman. Is it significant that in Pasuk 11, the word hand is in singular, and in Pasuk 12, it says hands in plural?
Once again, the singular and plural question, huh? Yes, in verse 11, it's singular. I don't know. I'm not sure about that. His hands were heavy, means his hands were both. It's not clear, by the way, is he always raising the same hand? I don't know. You know what I'm saying? Maybe he switches off. I have no idea, but I'm not sure about that. But I don't know. I have nothing good to say about it, so I'm not going to say. But right. Mizeh echad and mizeh echad, they're holding to his right there. Of course, they're two different people, one on each side. So one holds up one hand, one holds up the other hand, right? That's the point. As opposed to Moshe, maybe he was lifting one hand at a time. But mizeh echad and mizeh echad, he's being supported by two people, which of course is the court of three, the Bezdin of three. Who has the last question here? Debbie?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Is it possible that Refidim was the public name was what was known by others, and Masa Meriva is what Bnei Israel, what had been decided by God, and therefore, when it is Amalek, then we're back to Refidim.
It's certainly possible. It's certainly possible, no doubt. But I do think it is striking that Refidim, which means weakness of hands, is there to introduce a story about
Agreed.
weakness of
Right.
hands. So
Right.
whatever you want to say, I think that
That
is very
works
present in the
beautifully.
story.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
All right, we'll have to stop at this point. We'll continue next week with Amalek. There's a lot to say here. Looking forward to it. Okay, thank you all. Looking forward.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day and see you soon.
Thank you so much, Chodesh Tov.